My name is Marguerite Holt, and for 6 years I worked as the senior account strategist at a mid-sized marketing agency in Chicago called Allgate Media. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones quietly building a knife behind your back, and sometimes karma doesn't need your help at all. It just needs you to step out of the way and let the truth do its work. ID built my career on one thing: relationships. Not the fake, schmoozy kind, but real ones. I remembered birthdays. I remembered which clients hated being called before 10 in the morning. I remembered who'd just gone through a divorce and needed an extra week on a deadline. Over 6 years, ID built a client roster that was the envy of the office. 43 accounts, several of them worth six figures annually, all of them loyal to me specifically. When clients called the office, they asked for Marguerite. About 2 years ago, we hired a new business development manager named Dana Whitfield. She was sharp, polished, always impeccably dressed, and from day one she attached herself to me like a barnacle. She wanted to shadow my client calls to learn the ropes. She wanted to sit in on my pitch meetings. She asked endless questions about how ID built relationships with specific clients, what they liked, what they were sensitive about, how ID won them over in the first place. I thought she was just eager, ambitious. I'd been the new person once too, and I remembered how hard it was to break into an established team, so I mentored her. I introduced her to my clients as part of the team. I shared my notes. I shared everything. About 8 months ago, I started hearing whispers that Allgate was in talks with a much larger agency, a New York-based firm called Kestrel Group, about a potential acquisition. The kind of deal that, if it went through, would mean a massive payout for the partners and, more importantly for someone like me, a chance to negotiate a serious promotion or even a partnership stake, since my client roster represented nearly 30% of the agency's annual revenue. My boss, a man named Dominic Searle, who co-owned the agency, told me directly, "Marguerite, when this deal closes, you're going to be taken care of. Your book of business is the backbone of what's making us attractive to Kestrel." I believed him. ID worked there 6 years. ID turned down 2 recruiter calls in the past year alone because I trusted that loyalty meant something at Allgate. Then, about 6 weeks before the Kestrel deal was set to close, something strange happened. I came into the office on a Tuesday morning and found Dana already at her desk, which wasn't unusual, except that she quickly minimized something on her screen when she saw me and gave me this overly bright "good morning" that felt rehearsed. I didn't think much of it until later that day when one of my longtime clients, a man named Bertram Castillo, who ran a chain of furniture showrooms across the Midwest, called me. He sounded confused. "Marguerite, I just wanted to check. Did you and Dana both want to be on the quarterly review call, or was there a mix-up?" She sent over a calendar invite saying she'd be taking over as my primary contact going forward, and I wasn't sure if you'd left or something. My stomach dropped. I told him there was no change, that I was still his account lead, and that I'd look into it. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment, and then I started checking. I went into our CRM system, the shared client database, and I looked at the activity log for my accounts. What I found made my hands go cold. Over the previous 3 weeks, Dana had been quietly exporting data for my accounts. Not just contact information, full account histories, pricing structures, the personal notes ID built up over years about each client's preferences, their pain points, their decision-making processes, even notes about their personalities, like responds well to direct communication, dislikes being kept waiting, or key decision-maker is the wife. Always include her in proposals. This was the accumulated knowledge of 6 years of relationship building, and she'd been systematically downloading it. I also found something else. Buried in the activity log was a meeting that had been added to Dominic's calendar, a meeting between Dominic, Dana, and 2 representatives from Kestrel Group, scheduled for the following week. The meeting title was simply Client Transition Planning, Phase 1. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was rage. Pure, white-hot rage. I wanted to march into Dominic's office and scream. But I've learned something over the years, something my grandmother used to tell me when I was young and got into screaming matches with my brothers. The person who shouts first is usually the person who loses the argument, because everyone remembers the shouting and forgets why you were right. So instead, I closed my laptop, went home, and I thought. I thought for 2 full days. And during those 2 days, I did 3 things very quietly. First, I went back through the CRM logs and took screenshots, dozens of them, documenting every single export Dana had made with timestamps showing the pattern clearly began 6 weeks ago and escalated dramatically in the last 10 days. I saved these to a personal cloud account, not company storage. Second, I pulled up my original employment contract, which ID kept a copy of at home, and I found the clause I remembered being there, a non-disparagement and confidentiality clause, yes, but also, critically, a clause stating that any client relationships ID personally established and maintained were to be considered, for the purposes of any transition or restructuring event, my designated accounts unless I voluntarily reassigned them in writing. Dominic had insisted on this clause when I signed, actually, because at the time he wanted to guarantee that if I ever left, I couldn't poach clients without consequence. It cut both ways, though. It also meant the agency couldn't strip me of my accounts and hand them to someone else without my written consent, not without breaching my contract. Third, and this was the part that took the most patience, I reached out, not to my clients directly, which would have looked defensive and panicked, but to one person, Bertram Castillo, the client who'd called me about the confusing calendar invite. I asked him, very calmly, if he'd be willing to forward me the original email Dana had sent him, just so I could understand the miscommunication. He sent it within the hour. In the email, Dana had written, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, as Allgate moves toward an exciting new chapter with our partners at Kestrel Group, it'll be your new dedicated account lead going forward. Marguerite will be transitioning to a different role within the company. She had told a client I was being demoted before anyone had told me anything at all. Now I had everything I needed. I had proof of the data theft. I had the contractual language protecting my accounts. And I had written evidence that Dana was actively telling clients I'd been removed from my role, which was not only false, it was, frankly, defamatory, and it could have caused real damage to my professional reputation if clients started repeating it. On Thursday morning, I requested a meeting with Dominic. Not an urgent, dramatic, we need to talk right now meeting, just a normal-sounding quick check-in about the Kestrel transition, one make sure I'm aligned on next steps meeting. I wanted him relaxed. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him to think this was just me being a good soldier, eager to help the deal along. He took the meeting at 11 that morning. His office had this big window overlooking the car park, and he had his "I'm a busy, important man" posture going, leaning back, hands behind his head, that practiced casualness powerful people perform when they think they're in control of a conversation. Marguerite. Great, yes, come in. How are you feeling about everything? Exciting times. Very exciting, I said, sitting down and setting my folder on his desk. Just a plain folder, nothing dramatic. Actually, that's part of why I wanted to chat. I got a call yesterday from Bertram Castillo. He was a bit confused about a calendar invite he received. Dominic's expression did this small flicker, just a tiny twitch around the eyes, but he kept his casual tone. Oh, what kind of invite? Dana reached out to him directly to let him know she'd be taking over as his primary contact, and that I'd be, in her words, transitioning to a different role within the company. I let that sit for a second, which was news to me. Is there something I should know about? Because as far as I was aware, you told me 3 weeks ago that my accounts were a key part of what's making us attractive to Kestrel, and that I'd be taken care of once the deal closed. Dominic's posture shifted. He sat up a bit straighter. There's been some internal discussion about restructuring the client services team post-acquisition. Nothing's finalized. Dana may have gotten a bit ahead of things. A bit ahead of things, I repeated. Okay. Well, here's the thing, Dominic. I went into the CRM yesterday after that call because I wanted to understand what restructuring might mean for my book of business. And I found something I think you'll want to know about, because if this came out during Kestrel's due diligence process, it could be a real problem for the deal. I opened the folder and slid the printed screenshots across the desk, the export logs, the timestamps, the volume of data, the pattern over 6 weeks. Dana has exported the complete account histories, pricing structures, and personal client notes for all 43 of my accounts. The export started 6 weeks ago and ramped up significantly over the last 10 days. I also found a calendar entry titled Client Transition Planning, Phase 1 with 2 Kestrel representatives, scheduled for next Tuesday. I wasn't invited to that meeting, despite it concerning my own client accounts. Dominic picked up the papers, and I watched the color slowly drain from his face as he flipped through them. To his credit, he wasn't a stupid man. He understood immediately what this looked like. Internal data being quietly siphoned and reassigned to a different employee, behind the back of the person who had actually built those relationships, right before an acquisition where client retention and goodwill would be heavily scrutinized by Kestrel's legal and financial teams. If those 43 clients found out their information had been mishandled, or worse, if several of them, who were loyal to me personally, decided to leave entirely because they felt blindsided, the agency's valuation could take a serious hit. Acquisitions live and die on the stability of the thing being acquired. Marguerite, I wasn't aware of the scope of this. Let me look into. I also want to point you to Section 4, Subsection 2 of my employment contract. I continued, sliding over a second document, my contract, with the relevant clause highlighted in yellow. The one you specifically asked me to sign 6 years ago. It states that client relationships I've personally established are designated as my accounts during any transition or restructuring event, unless I provide written reassignment. I haven't provided any written reassignment. So, whatever phase one was planning to do, it would have been a direct breach of contract. I let that sink in for a moment, and then I said the thing I'd practiced in my head about 30 times over the previous 2 days, in the calmest voice I could manage. I'm not here to make this difficult, Dominic. I actually want this deal to go through. I think it's good for the agency and honestly good for me too. But I needed you to understand what's been happening because I don't think you did. And I think it's worth asking why Dana felt confident enough to start this process 6 weeks ago, telling clients I was being removed, without anyone clearing it with me or with you, apparently. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his desk phone and asked his assistant to get Dana to come to his office. Right away, please. I won't drag out the next 20 minutes too much, except to say that Dana walked in expecting, I think, to discuss the Kestrel meeting prep. Instead, she found me sitting there with a folder of evidence and Dominic looking like a man who'd just realized he was about to sign off on a problem he didn't know existed. To her credit, or perhaps just because she was cornered, she didn't even try to deny the exports. What she tried to argue was that she'd been given the impression by someone she was vague about who, that my accounts were in play for reassignment as part of the acquisition prep, and that she'd simply been getting ahead of the curve. But the email to Bertram Castillo was the part she couldn't talk her way around. Telling a client in writing that I'd been removed from my role, before that was true, before anyone had even discussed it with me, wasn't getting ahead of the curve. It was either a lie she'd told to start positioning herself with my clients, or it was something she'd been told to do by someone who was confident enough in this plan that they hadn't bothered to loop me in at all, because they assumed I'd simply go along with it or not find out until it was too late. Dominic, to his credit, once the reality of the legal and financial exposure set in, moved fast. Dana was placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation, official language for escorted out before lunch. The Kestrel transition meeting was cancelled, and over the following week, Dominic personally called every one of my 43 clients, not to apologize for anything specific, since that would have raised more questions than it answered, but simply to confirm continuity of their account team ahead of the upcoming partnership announcement, which let him reassure clients that Marguerite Holt was, and would remain, their dedicated contact. Bertram Castillo, when I called him to thank him for forwarding that email, just laughed and said, "Marguerite, I've worked with you for 9 years. I wasn't about to start taking instructions from someone I'd never heard of over an email that didn't even sound like you wrote it." As for the Kestrel deal, it closed about 5 weeks later, and Dominic, true to his earlier word, actually came through this time. I was offered and accepted a client partnerships director role with an equity stake in the newly merged entity, reporting directly to the Kestrel leadership rather than to Dominic. My accounts came with me, formally documented this time, with my name explicitly attached to each one in the new contracts, something I made sure of personally, sitting in on every relevant meeting myself. I heard, secondhand, that Dana didn't get a severance package, given that the data export activity constituted a clear breach of company policy and likely several confidentiality clauses in her own contract. Dominic apparently decided that pursuing any kind of reference or recommendation for her wasn't something he was inclined to bother with. I don't know what she's doing now. I don't think about it much, honestly. What I think about instead is how close it came to working. If Bertram hadn't called me, if had just gone along with the new contact out of politeness, the way a lot of people do because confronting an awkward email feels more trouble than it's worth, I might not have found out until it was too late to do anything but watch my career get quietly handed to someone else. 6 years of relationships, built one conversation, one remembered birthday, one late-night email at a time, almost walked out the door because someone decided that knowledge belonged to them simply because they'd been clever enough to copy it down. But it didn't work. And I think about that too, about how often the people trying to take something they didn't build assume that the person who built it won't notice, won't fight, won't have kept the receipts. They assume patience means weakness. They assume kindness means you want pushback. ID mentored Dana. ID shared everything with her because I remembered what it was like to be new and unsure. And she looked at that generosity and saw an opportunity. I don't regret being kind to her, for what it's worth. I just regret that I had to learn the hard way that kindness and trust are two very different things, and that you can give someone the first without ever having to give them the second.